And then, but because Dolby was really big in 3D, I got very friendly with Dolby. And Dolby Cinema was my screening theater. And it was really cool. Like, I would go there and, shake hands with Peter Jackson, who would screen just before me and stuff like that. Even though I was a small company, something, I was playing with this kind of big guys, right? And Dolby one day invited me and they said to me, "Hey, Dado, we want to show you something. We have this thing called Dolby Vision." I was like, "What's that?" And so they took me to a room and they showed me this TV that looked like, Frankenstein, like had these wires hanging out with big screws, right? But when they showed me the picture, I was like, wow, what is this? What is this? Oh, it's a high dynamic range, Dolby Vision. But it was like a prototype of Dolby Vision. So I started playing with it. It was like, it was a toy, that I enjoyed. I was like, okay, so and they were quite happy that, to let me into the room and play around. And I think most of my time, actually, when I was playing with Dolby Vision, I was fixing this kind of unit that would actually do the calculation for HDR to SDR transform that somehow was crashing all the time. It was like, it was a prototype. It was a thing, we would constantly call Burbank and ask, "Hey, what's happening? How should we do this?" And but granted, I had some experience in HDR, even very limited. I had it, and I really thought like, this is going to be good. But somebody at Dolby was incredibly good in selling it. And I was so surprised when I got a phone call from Netflix. And they said to me, "Oh, we want to shoot a very first HDR show." And I was thinking like, wait, hang on a moment, this is still like so beta, these technologies. Like, there were these papers and presentations, but, really practically we had very little experience with it. And amazing. I was like, okay. Netflix, tech company, right? They are like completely thinking differently, right? And not film studios. Because if you were to ask film studios, it would take another decade before first HDR would be done. But Netflix saw an opportunity. And so they said to me, "Would you be able to help us? We understand, we were told, that you're somebody who knows it." As I would say, "I know, but yeah, I probably know more than most other people, but I don't know a lot, But anyway, okay, let's do it." And they put me on this show called Marco Polo Season 2. Why? Because there was most HDR TVs back then were sold in Korea and in Japan. So not necessarily, there was not so many TVs in Europe and US, right? So they thought like, okay, if we're going to make a show, let's make a show that audience is going to be able to watch. And then, for Netflix, it was very easy to integrate HDR because all they had to do is update their software, and they had HDR. Again, if this was down to standard, way how film and TV industry was working, it would take decades, right? And then we were prepping, and actually everybody was looking at, HDR as a way to double their income, right? You know what I'm saying? Because we would like, okay, we have a normal process, the standard dynamic range process, and then we have to do HDR, and we're going to charge twice. And, so that was really what everybody thought, like, oh, this HDR thing is just going to be this kind of way for us to print money a little bit, a license. So yeah, it's exciting. Let's do it. And then I remember it was one of the kind of last meetings before we were like, I think the prep was done in Paris, and then we had to go to shoot in Kuala Lumpur. And it was one of those last things. I think I was in Australia, I remember, when that call happened or something like that. And that's where Netflix told us the hard truth about HDR. And they said the only way for HDR to be adopted is to cost the same as SDR. And you guys have to figure out how we're going to do that. Oh, by the way, because these are first jobs, we understand there's going to be 30% increase in budget, right? But just to cover the whole technicality of, since we're doing it for the first time. And that was like a wow. That was kind of the new generation of Hollywood. right? That would, it's not how studios think. Like even studios would throw huge amount of money on HDR because they would hope to resell it. Like they were hoping maybe they're going to be selling Blu-ray discs for double the price because it's HDR. You understand? So studios also saw completely different business model in HDR, but Netflix, no. They were like included in your monthly $10 subscription or whatever it was. $14 maybe, I don't know. But it was like a no, and it has to cost the same. This is the tech mind, the tech people. And that was really, really one of the most challenging things. Luckily, for Netflix, I think it's still working, a color scientist called Chris Clark, who had a very good understanding of color management. And I heard of him while I was working for Warner Brothers. He was back then at the Sony Columbia. So I kind of heard of him. He's a really regarded as a top, in his domain. And then together with him, we built this workflow that minimized the amount of doubling, basically, where we would then just color grade everything once and then trim this color grade and then have a SDR and HDR version as Dolby really intended. Even though like Dolby intended it, nobody really wanted to do it like that because everybody was trying to say, no, let me do it twice to charge twice, right? But no, so somehow with Chris, we figured out the way, and that really became formula, or actually it was like a technical document to how to do HDR, right? And so think about it. We know now, probably most people who are in this industry or who have been working last few years in this industry know that HDR suddenly, started taking over. And so who's going to do it? Who are we going to hire to show us how to do it? Oh, Dado, right? And suddenly my job, stopped being just a guy who's grading, and I became more of a person that was just traveling around the world and working with different productions, post-production, studios, consulting, teaching, training. And I remember I think, British Airways sent me, this kind of golden card for my air miles, or I mean, literally, I think every week I was in another continent, not another town. It was just, my job became incredibly, exciting in that way, that I worked all over the world. And I also lectured on almost every international film school, and that kind of established me as a lecturer as well. And then also that made me improve all my software and plugins and everything. So they were the first tools that industry professionals were able to use that were adapted for HDR. So then these tools that I used normally internally became adopted worldwide by, I think we had maybe 8,000 users of Look Designer, my very first software that I developed for look development, because it worked in HDR and SDR. And, I really liked that, I really enjoyed that. And at the same time, I had a facility running in London, and we were doing major Warner Brothers movies there, or my team was rather doing it. And then Warner Brothers said to me, Dado, we want to expand in London. We want to make it even bigger. And I really didn't like that. I was like, I cannot, there is enough stress, enough work, for me, just to oversee what's happening already. And now I really didn't think that, I felt that maybe my time is done on working on big movies in that way, how I used to work in running my own post-production company, or, outsourcing the services of picture post. And I felt like there is a little bit more than that in life.